So which of you students are going back to China? Are all of you going? Billy? David? Not you, Tony? You're staying. Okay. Bailey? Yes? Nora? Okay. When's the first one leave? The 9th of June? Okay. On the 19th of June. So most of them will just be for a couple of weeks. 19th of July. Okay. New ones coming July 1st. Any names we can be working on? Crystal. Okay. Crystal, Tony, Edwin. Start writing. Start writing. And Bailey will be a senior. You're the only senior next year. Nora's a senior as well. Okay. And Vinci. We've certainly counted it a blessing to have you here with us. It's been a great joy to get to know you, and pray that you have a great summer, and that's great. All right, well, I certainly am glad to have the remnant here today, and I got to thinking as we were coming a couple weeks ago, sort of projecting where we were going to be this week, realized that I was going to sort of break the mood. Here, most of you are in the midst of like a 3-day weekend, and I want to talk today about work. So it just happens to be where the text has us, okay? But Paul is continuing to get just increasingly practical and pointed. We've said, he's gotten to the point now where he's meddling, right? He's into our junk, the day-to-day aspects of our life. Starts talking about marriage, starts talking about parenting. And, of course, next to those categories, our vocation would be the greatest allocation of our time and our energies. It's a huge part of our life, our work. And so Paul turns his attention there in these verses in Ephesians chapter 6. Forbes magazine recently ranked the 9 toughest leadership tasks. The list included university president, corporate CEO, but topping the list was stay-at-home parent. Economic worth was estimated to be $100,000. Not sure you can quite tab it with dollars and cents, can you? But obviously this morning we're talking about more than just maybe a job that you get a paycheck from. No matter what your situation, whether you're a student or a retiree or someone who's working a traditional type of job or a stay-at-home parent, or you're unemployed, we all have tasks, we all have work that we are called to do. So no one's really exempt from these particular instructions. And it does seem to me that there's a bit of this is rather anecdotal, I don't have statistics some statistics, but it just seems to me that there's sort of a general restlessness and malaise among believers when it comes to their work, their vocation. Statistically, only 19% of Americans say that they're satisfied with their work. So certainly culturally, there's sort of this angst, this love-hate relationship with what we do, our task. In many cases, work is seen as merely a paycheck. It's something to be endured. We live for the weekend. A lot of people who are just downright miserable in their work. I've had frequent conversations with people who are looking for my blessing. They want to quit their job. They don't have anything else to replace it with, but they just want to quit. They're that miserable. They'd rather have no job at all than the job they have. Right? So I hope that's not your situation, but it's reality. A lot of people really struggle to one degree or another with their work. And the landscape is changing vocationally in our country. The typical young adult does not expect to have a single job for more than 3 to 5 years. It's just not that expectation that I'm going to work long-term at something. There's just sort of this restlessness that's kind of built into the system now, right? There's not corporate loyalty anymore either, so many people with no necessarily desire to change jobs find themselves swimming back into the job market again, having to retrain. But we live in very unique times. There's even some very vivid conversation going on, and I'm not talking in church circles here, but in the culture. The article I cite here was in the Atlantic magazine, not exactly your bastion of conservative theological thought. But the thought here is many professional women wrestling with whether they can have it all. Profession, career, family, and if so, at what cost? Again, these aren't believers having these discussions. This is a conversation that's happening. You punch it in, do your Google search, and find all the different articles that are being written, just wrestling with that question. So there's a lot of things that we sort of work through in this area of our vocation. We certainly want to understand it more fully. And when we understand Paul's instructions here, Ephesians 6, remember the context. Remember how Paul started this dialogue about husbands and wives, parents and children, and now masters and slaves. Back in chapter 5, verse 15, he says, I want you to be careful how you live then, not as unwise, but as wise. So he's talking not just about ethics. It's not just about right and wrong. It's not about how to live moral lives. He's talking about how to live wisely. He's talking about how to live life in a full way, how to navigate life effectively. So this is good stuff when we think about our work and the angst that we sometimes experience with our work. We want to know how to navigate life, how to live it well in the arena of our vocation, in our work, our task. So let's look together. Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. Masters, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. Well, the first thing that we recognize in this text is terminology, right? Kind of jumps off the page. Slaves, masters. And if you've done any studying, or depending on the translation you have in front of you, the terminology might come across differently. I'm holding more of an early original English Standard Version of the new rendering of this text, and the newer English Standard updates reads bondservants instead of slaves. The NIV recently did an update in 2011, but they have retained the word slaves. There's a big difference, isn't there, between a slave and a servant? So it's kind of interesting to think of the terminology and how it's brought across. I would suggest to you, and I think everyone would agree, that the best translation of the word is slave. I mean, a servant can quit, right? A slave can only run away. You know, a servant sort of has his own or her own will, her own schedule, a certain level of autonomy. A slave does not. And clearly the indication here is of a slave. The problem is, and what the translators have wrestled with, is that particularly in our modern culture, there are some pretty significant connotations that just automatically go with that terminology, isn't there? Slavery, right? We think the slavery of African Americans, an early portion of our country's history. We might think of sexual slavery that happens in many parts of our world, human trafficking, right? So we have very strong connotations. And that's very different than what would have been the case in the ancient world. Certainly there were abuses of slavery. That's why Paul's writing about it. But there were also some very different nuances. It was a very vital part of society, and it served a very real function. It wasn't ethnic in the ancient world. It wasn't one group of people subjugating another group of people. It was generally economic. So if you owed more than you could pay, you didn't file for bankruptcy. Okay, there was no such thing. So you would enter into slavery to pay off your debt. In general, it was generally temporary, or could be a temporary situation. And generally, and the Scripture even outlined this in the Old Testament law, you weren't really buying a person, you were securing their labor. And so you would calculate the number of seasons, the number of crops. It was going to require 4 years' worth of crops to pay off your debt. And then generally that person would be able to secure their freedom. Okay, so it was a very different type of notion than we think of in our modern context, the cultural context. So for this reason, the translators of the English Standard Version have said, we're going to land somewhere between slaves. We want to avoid some of the wrong associations with the word slave, and yet we need to say something a little stronger than servant. So this bond-servant terminology is what they've chosen to utilize. The Old Testament actually included also a very interesting caveat that a person could be a voluntary slave. They could have secured their freedom, paid off their debt, or in the Old Testament there was a year of Jubilee that came once every 49 years where all debts were surrendered and a slave would be freed. But very often the slave would choose to remain with his master. He had a good master who treated him well. And there was a protocol. You'd put your ear up against the wood of the doorpost, and they'd drive an awl through your ear, and you'd be marked as a bondservant. You were a slave, albeit one who had chosen to be a slave. And so very, very different than the notions of slavery that we sometimes interact with today. But that terminology, we have to acknowledge it because it sort of jumps off the page at us as we read this text. We're, of course, led to then think of how to interpret the passage. We aren't generally dealing with slavery in our day-to-day lives. But the applicational principle here is very clear, and it's our vocation. It's our work. A third of the Roman Empire were slaves. You were generally either a slave owner or a slave. Those were the categories. There really wasn't a category of employer and employee. But this is the vocational arena. It's dealing with our work. Now, we're also a bit surprised as we read through these verses that Paul does not call a spade a spade. That Paul does not kind of come out straight against this whole institution of slavery. Right? Matter of fact, he dodges, he doesn't deal with it as a moral issue at all. I want to suggest to you by way of sort of a thesis this morning that God is more concerned about you living godly in the midst of your circumstances than he is with changing your circumstances. God's desire is, generally speaking, for you to change your attitude, not your job. I want my circumstances to be changed. But that's not necessarily God's main intent. God's intent is to change us, to conform us into the image of Christ, to cause us to reflect Christ in the world, to suffer even in his name, to follow Christ's pattern, not to necessarily remove all the impediments from in front of us, right? So I think that's another very important thing that we need to know here. And Paul talks about this in other texts as well. I think I've given you 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in your notes. He writes, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him." Interesting terminology. Assign. You're not where you are vocationally, or you're not in the marriage you're at, or in that particular friendship, or living in a particular house just by chance. All these things are part of God's assignment. It's the place he's put you. He has an intent in all of this. So let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. In other words, when you became a believer, is this your condition? Were you an employee? Were you in, whatever? Remain in that condition. Don't feel compelled to have to change it. Don't be discontent. And then he gets specific. Were you a slave when you were called, when you became a believer? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. So it might be an opportunity, that's great. But don't become fixated on it. Okay? Don't miss the particular things that God is wanting you to accomplish right where you're at in that difficult job. Right? And I feel like if there's ever a time we needed Paul's exhortation, it's in the 21st century. Again, there's this general malaise, this general discontent. I think we need to hear Paul's words again in our day. That it is good to remain faithful where you are, in the place that God has assigned you. Okay, it's not insignificant. Notice how that validates work. The task that you are doing, even as a slave, is significant. God has something for you there, even if you can't see it and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere or contributing to much of anything. God's at work in that. Tremendous validation of our labor in that passage, and I think we need to hear that. I think we also need to realize that work is an ordinance. It's a command. I was reading some of John Murray and his writings and reflectings on the fourth commandment, right? Remember the Sabbath. We think of that as a command to do what? Not a trick question. To rest, thank you. Yeah, it's a command to rest. But it is also, according to Murray, and I think he's right, a command to work. For on 6 days you will labor, and on the 7th you will rest. God has sanctified the 7th day. And sometimes we struggle in both of those arenas. We struggle to really acknowledge and cease from our laboring on that 1 day in 7. And we also at times don't really do well to be persistent in working the other 6 days. But it's clearly part of God's design for us, and it is valuable. And Paul gets specific. I mean, there's a lot of text that we could look at with this, but Paul gets specific even in how you work. In other words, Paul doesn't have in mind if you can just sort of hit the lottery and then not have to work, at least you put food on the table. That's not what Paul has in mind. Not what God has in mind. He says, working with your hands. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. He's already dealt with this. He uses words of toil, expending yourself. This is part of God's intent for us, that we work and exert ourselves in a given task. So let's consider the two primary commands that he addresses here. This will constitute our very simple outline this morning. First, to those who are slaves, who are employees, who are workers. You are under someone else's authority in the workplace. Here is Paul's instruction for you. You should obey those who are over you in the workplace. You should obey those who are over you in the workplace. The same strong word that he used to describe the child's responsibility to his or her parents. Obey. Paul does begin to shape our thinking here by referring to earthly masters. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Pointing us to the fact that our vocation, the actual nitty-gritty of the workplace, is only sort of part of a bigger picture, right? And he's going to develop this here, that Jesus is our master. So I'm serving this boss or this employer, but in a more robust sense, in a more ultimate sense, I am serving Christ. So he makes this reference to an earthly master as opposed to a heavenly master or an ultimate master. And I don't want you to, in the midst of this as well, as we look at these practical instructions to miss the gospel here. It is so prevalent. It just jumps off the page in this text. With every exhortation, with every little angle, an additional piece of instruction, he refers to Christ. He refers to our relationship with Christ. He refers to our new standing that we have as Christ's servants. So just notice it in a cursory way. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ. Verse 7, rendering service with a good will, as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. So our identity in Christ changes everything. We have been purchased out of slavery to sin, and we now have a new master, a benevolent master, a generous master, a master who gives remuneration, who rewards his servants, his slaves. We put our ear to the post and said, drive it through. I am your slave, Jesus. This is the new identity. And so if you're here apart from Christ, your labor is truly just that. It's just labor. It might seem productive, it might not, but for a believer, we understand that we're serving someone beyond our human employer, our human boss. And a great just element of the gospel here, the hope of the gospel. The gospel is what gives purpose. If you're here apart from Christ, you have no hope. You're not part of the unfolding events of God's plan for his people. But specifically, there's some implications here for the slave, for the employee, in how they are to obey. What does it look like? First, you should work respectfully. You should work respectfully. You should obey with fear and trembling. You should not be casual or cavalier with your employer. You shouldn't be argumentative or insubordinate. Don't speak harshly or disrespectfully when you disagree with their opinion. Don't confront them on the floor of the factory. Okay? If you have an appeal you'd like to make, then you go to them, you set up an appointment, and you talk to them, and you issue your appeal. And if they disagree or dismiss your concern, then swallow hard and get back to work. All right? It's part of acting respectfully to that employer. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities to rationalize disrespect. Your employer might be a jerk. You might be unfair, inequitable. Maybe he's a Christian, and he's unfair, and he's inequitable. And you think, yeah, of all things, he says he's a... Peter's pretty explicit. Whether they are just or unjust, he says in the second chapter of his letter. It doesn't matter. You are to obey them. You are to come under their authority. You might be tempted to relate to your employer in a casual way because they are a Christian. But Paul addresses that too in 1 Timothy. He says you ought to be actually more motivated to do a good job and to respond appropriately because you're helping to contribute to the welfare of a brother or sister in the family of God. That ought to be extra incentive to do your best. So there's no exceptions to this. We are to act in a respectful way. And again, Paul's point is not so much that your boss is great and what he's really driving at here is you are to respect him in fear and trembling as you would Christ, because you understand that he's been placed in that position of authority. He represents Christ's authority in your life. If you disrespect him, if you disobey him, if you're insubordinate to him, you are insubordinate and disobedient to Christ. So you should work respectfully. He adds to that you ought to work with a sincere heart. The word for sincerity is also translated single or undivided. It speaks of a purity of motive. Its most common use in the New Testament is to describe a generous person. How does a person who is single have to do with, or focused, or has a pure motive? How does that relate to generosity? Well, a generous person is concerned about the needs of others, right? And he gives of himself, of his time, of his resources. He's not giving in a calculated fashion, a true generous person, right? He's not sitting there thinking, and then I covered all that, okay, and then I can scrape a little bit off the top and put it over here. No, a generous person gives and maybe in some ways compromises their own ability to provide for themselves. It hurts, right? But that's that singleness of motive. And so as I think what Paul's getting at here is that you should not just speak respectfully to your employer, but that this ought to be something that flows out of a sincere heart. That you don't kind of, yes ma'am, yes sir, and then walk out into the break room and start commiserating and complaining with the other employees, okay? So you're not respectful, at least not respectful with a sincere heart, at least not thoroughly respectful. This is calling for a heart respect. Honor them when they're around and when they're not. You should work faithfully. Text says you should not work by way of eye service as people pleasers. Eye service describes a person who serves in order to be recognized. Right? They work when someone is watching. They work to get attention. They work when they're under the security camera. And they know they're being seen. They work to impress a person. On the contrary, we ought to be faithful and loyal, serving even when no one is around to keep track of us. You should not serve to please your boss, who's watching sometimes, but to please Christ, who's watching all the time. Christ is not only discerning your outward actions, but also your inner disposition and motivation. Notice again the reference to God's will. Not the first time Paul's made reference to it. Verse 6, not by way of eye services, people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. What is God's will for you? To be a good worker. Not all worried about how many classes you should take next semester. Look, God's will is not rocket science. His will for you and for me to be good workers. I worked 2 summers at a bridge construction company, pretty small outfit, not like Mackinac Bridge construction, but like little overpasses and things like that. And our job, we worked in Saginaw one summer. That was my first summer, and all these, rotted out areas of the overpass, the concrete that was sort of falling apart. And our job was to go up on these lifts, and we were using these little jackhammers, not the big ones that you use on the road, but little ones that you hold in your hand at your side. And it was one of the most miserable summers I've spent in a long time. The hardest physical labor I have ever done. And I remember my superior, as we arrived at the work site that first day, and he says, this tip here, he says, they'll break. He said, and it's $50 part. He says, and you'll be paying for it. He wasn't one to smile a lot, so I wasn't sure if he was serious or if he was just trying to set the tone or what. But so he says, and the way you avoid breaking these tips is you keep pressure. If you're kind of slacking off on it and it's just bouncing against the cement, it's going to break the tip. You've got to continue to apply pressure to the concrete, okay, when you're operating this. So it's interesting. It's kind of like this. That tip was the ultimate truth teller as to whether I was doing my job, right? At the end of the day, that was going to indicate whether I was really pressing, really exerting myself in this job. Now, not every job's like that, right? Perhaps your job has like a little mechanism that tells you exactly how hard you're working. But a lot of jobs, there's a certain amount of flex in that, right? There's times when you're doing different things, you're having to give account for your time, use your time well. And that's kind of his point here, is that I don't want you to just do the right thing or work hard because you know someone's keeping track or somebody's watching the tips. I'm going to have to account for how many tips I use. But you do this because Christ is watching you and you want to please Christ. Had a really encouraging phone interaction with one of our members a few weeks ago. I called them in the morning, left a message on their voicemail, and got a call back about 12:30. And this individual says, "Yeah, I just wanted to get back to you. I picked up your message when I checked my phone on my lunch break." I thought, good for you. Maybe your job makes allowances and you can check email or your phone messages or text or do whatever. But I was really impressed that this person was conscientious enough to presumably follow their company policy, or was just a conscientious enough worker to turn a novel concept, to turn the phone off. Can you turn a phone off? I didn't know you could turn a cell phone off. Kind of a novel thought, isn't it? But when I think about it, whose time am I on, right? Am I on my time or am I on my boss's time? And so that's part of being faithful. Your job undoubtedly has certain things that are part of the expectation for you in terms of computer use and all these sorts of things. And so that's part of being a good worker. You should work faithfully. You should also work eagerly. The text says, rendering service with a good will. This means that you work with enthusiasm. You don't give the bare minimum. Don't work begrudgingly. Don't work only when you are constrained to do so. Don't just get by on what you have to do, but work heartily. Work with gusto. Go above and beyond, as the Jesus book said. Give it everything you got. Okay, that's the idea here, to expend yourself fully in your work. Again, you do this as to the Lord, not to man. So you don't have to sit there and think, yeah, but my boss doesn't deserve my best. He's not giving his best. No, it doesn't matter, because you're doing it for Christ, and he does deserve your best. He is your true ultimate master. Extends a motivation. Christ, our true master, has promised remuneration. You should work, and here's the key word, knowing, here's the motivation, right? Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. So you might feel unappreciated. You might feel like much of your work goes unnoticed. But if we understand that God has established all authority, so when I serve my employer, I'm actually serving God, then I would expect that I'm going to receive recognition from my ultimate employer, my ultimate master, who's Christ. You do good to your employer, Jesus will do good to you. And he moves it beyond just the realm of slavery. No matter what your task is, remember, whether this is the case, whether he is slave or free. So whether you have a traditional job, whether you're working as a stay-at-home parent, whether you're retired, engaged in various types of tasks, the good that you do is seen by your master and will be remunerated, will be acknowledged. Thinking this week of Amy Anderson, working as our nursery coordinator. Some of you didn't even know Amy was our nursery coordinator. Shame on you. We want your phone number and email contact address afterwards if you don't know Amy. But yeah, there's a lot of aspects. Now Sherry's pretty involved, so I get in on some of the struggle of trying to get people to serve in various capacities, and I probably only know the half of it, right? Great deal of what Amy does is done behind the scenes. But Christ knows. Christ's keeping track. Not one detail, not one hour that she's spent has gone unnoticed to Christ. And we could go on and list all of our different tasks in this. Story is told of an elderly missionary couple who is returning from Africa after a lifetime of service. And they happened to be on the same ship that was carrying President Theodore Roosevelt. And President Roosevelt was coming back from a hunting expedition, big game hunting, and he's coming off the gangplank here to the applause of the crowds and the accolades, and all of his mounts, were coming down off the gangplank with him. And this elderly missionary couple comes off after all of that, comes off alone, feeling a bit sorry for themselves, until they reminded each other that they weren't home yet. That's our mindset. We know that when I get home, and we're not home yet, when I get home, We will receive the accolades of a generous master who treats his servants equitably and doesn't miss any of their labor. Talked about low morale in many workplaces. Cost of living is increasing. Benefits are being diminished. A lot of debate about minimum wage, right? Legislation that needs to be raised. Can't get by on this. All this angst in the workplace, and I feel like there's a great opportunity for us as God's people to really live distinctively in the workplace. To really evidence lives of joy. It doesn't mean we're always going to really enjoy all the different details of what happens, but we can still live joy and have this greater sense of purpose that I just feel like there's a tremendous opportunity for us to live in that way. Paul does give a brief statement here to masters as well, to employers. And I would say, really, whether you own a business or not, if you have people who are working under you, if you're a supervisor, then this is for you. Okay, so some might fall into two categories. You might be an employee with people over you, and you might also be one who is managing other people. Here's his singular instruction for them. You should treat with dignity those who are under you in the workplace. To treat them with dignity. It's a very interesting phrase in verse 9. Masters, do the same to them. What does that mean? He's either saying that the master should treat the slave as the slave has been treating the master in the same way. The slave is to respect the master, to act in the master's best interest, and the master is to do the same for the slave, right? Well, I think the other way of reading this is that he's actually saying that the master should treat the slave equitably as Christ treats his slaves equitably. Notice the immediate context of verse 8. The slave is to know that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. And masters should do likewise. Masters should treat their slaves as Christ treats his slaves, equitably, with respect, with dignity, with value. The implication is that you should not use your authority to harm those working under you. Stop your threatening. You shouldn't be harsh. You shouldn't use emotional manipulation. You shouldn't ever demean a person. You should not dehumanize them. You should not hold unrealistic expectations. You should not withhold wages. You should not amass wealth through the destruction of another person. And the motivation is given here as well. You too are under authority. You and your workers share a common master who will judge without partiality. So all authority involves stewardship. In other words, God doesn't give anyone authority and say, hey, do with it what you want. God invests people with authority. All authority comes from God. He invests people with authority. But with that authority comes a responsibility. And you will be evaluated based on how you stewarded that authority. The Puritan Richard Baxter commented on this as he talked to masters. He said, remember that you are Christ's trustees, or the guardians of their souls, and that the greater your power is over them, the greater your charge is of them, and your duty for them. It's a heavy responsibility to have authority, not to be used lightly. Well, we started this morning acknowledging that there's a great many people who are frustrated with their job. I want to remind you that God is interested in changing your attitude, not your job. Abraham Lincoln said most people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. You can make a choice, no matter how difficult your task is. You can make a choice to view it differently, to embrace gospel perspective that you are serving Christ in your work. Your work has meaning. And every menial thing, every frustrating task that you take on is being seen and recorded and will be acknowledged. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for the gospel saturation of this text. We've been considering all through our study here in Ephesians about our identity and how it changes everything. We aren't just doing a job, but we are your servants. We serve a generous, gracious master, and a master who sees and keeps track of everything. So all of our work has value within your kingdom. I pray, God, that you would just break our misconceptions, strip away our bad attitudes, the bitterness that maybe we're holding on to towards that employer or employee, the bad habits that have developed over time where we are really not acting respectfully, or we're maybe stealing time from our employer instead of being a faithful worker when he's not around. God, shape us, conform us into the image of Christ. We pray in Jesus, our Savior's name. Amen. Amen. You're dismissed.